It can be complicated to define a genre as wide and broad as science fiction. We have 4,000 to 6,000 years of literary history, and almost all of it dealt with fantastic elements. Heroes and gods doing things that were definitely extraordinarily different. Well, starting in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, life changed for the average reader in Europe and America. The social order went through ructions and transformations, and yet people started to actually get a sense that of their 5 children, 3 or 4 of them were highly likely to live. There was more and more stability in life. And so you started seeing so-called mainstream literature focus in on daily life. Now that didn't mean fantasy went away. You had Gulliver's Travels and so on, leading to the woman we call the grandmother of science fiction, Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, followed by the 2 dads of science fiction, Verne and Wells. Clearly what they did was science fiction. Science and technology drove and propelled what they were talking about. And yet, the older tradition of fantasy continued. They go to the same section of the bookstore, fantasy and science fiction. Yet much is said about the difference between these genres. Science fiction breaks with the old tradition of Homer and Achilles and all those legends because they were largely about demigods and gods and uber beings, Nietzschean uber beings, where science fiction started talking instead about us. It started saying, all right, the main character here is above average, but only above average, not a god. And the crew and team that he or she puts together is going to do something marvelous using tools that some other team could replicate, some other group will replicate. It's the notion that is in science fiction that the premise might change. The basics of life might change.
Mortality as home entertainment? This cannot be the future! Can it?
So you see what I was mentioning earlier, that society was starting to change over the course of a single person's generation. Your son might enter a profession that you had never even heard of. Your daughter might take for granted social mores that would have been shocking to your mother. The fundamental premise of science fiction violates the premise of fantasy and comics, going back to Homer. And the premise is children can learn from the mistakes of their parents. You notice I said can, not will they. Because science fiction is very good at developing what's called the self-preventing prophecy, the dire warning. On the Beach, or Dr. Strangelove, Soylent Green, Silent Spring, George Orwell's 1984. These were all terrifying stories that had the purpose, and they achieved it, of frightening millions of readers or viewers into deciding they are going to expend some of their effort for the rest of their life to making sure that this failure mode won't happen. And arguably, we're here today because the failure modes that could have led to nuclear war that were exposed in Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, and On the Beach were paid attention to. And then those stories made themselves not happen. They were self-preventing prophecies. In these dire warning stories, children don't learn from the mistakes of their parents. They make new mistakes that are horrible, that are terrifying, like in Soylent Green, wrecking the world. But the implicit assumption is they could have not made this mistake. Now that makes for a more chilling kind of tragedy.
It's people. Soylent Green is made out of people.
In the Poetics, Aristotle defines tragedy as being typified by the play Oedipus, where Oedipus is doomed from the beginning of the play to follow a path that cannot be avoided. Now, when you watch Oedipus follow this foredoomed path, you weep because it's meant to extol, to draw sympathy from you, and the play is still fantastically effective. But a modern person raised on science fiction is tempted to leap on the stage, put a bullet in poor Oedipus's head, and then go hunting gods for having done this.
Anybody else want to negotiate?
The premise is this didn't have to happen. And of course, some science fiction shows children learning from the mistakes of their parents and making a better world, as in Star Trek. This is a fundamental difference that breaks from the old tradition, fantasy, comics, Homeric fairy tales that you see in almost all ancient tribes. They all had the fantastic, and they follow Joseph Campbell's arcs. Even though science fiction follows these same arcs of the fantastic, science fiction breaks from these arcs.
That's what all this is about. A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.